So again, welcome everyone, the people here in the room physically with us, and the ones online who have joined via miraculous Zoom. We have the great joy to welcome today an old friend of ours, the Institute's, Dr. Simon Wilson. Simon is a senior lecturer in the Faculty of Arts, Humanities and Education at Canterbury Christ Church University. He has a special interest in landscape, co-creation, love of learning, and the theology of the Orthodox Church. His latest publication is The Fierce Urgency of Now and Forever, and Unto Ages of Ages, Study and the Restoration of Paradise on Earth. This was published in the International Journal of Sustainability and Higher Education. So we're delighted to have Simon with us. Again, he is also a member of our institute, so we also see him either physically or online at our AGMs. So Simon, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm absolutely delighted and honoured to be asked to give a little talk here. Before I start, I'd just like to say that I'm going to dedicate this to Lisa. And before I give my talk too, I'd like to give a little bit of context really for the talk itself. It's a version of a draft of a chapter that I was asked to contribute to a book on education and sustainability. And so while most of it does indeed involve theology, and largely the theology of the Eastern Orthodox Church, which is one of my great interests, as Razvan said, I also, towards the end of the talk, move beyond that to a more kind of general discussion of love, poetry, beauty, and education. And perhaps these meditations will have a validity in the wider precincts of higher education beyond the study of theology. So I'll start. What if education wasn't first and foremost about what we know, but about what we love? Asks philosopher and theologian James K.A. Smith. What if indeed education nurtured a knowing which is itself a form of loving, and a loving which is itself a form of knowing? What if knowing and loving were inextricably linked, and their intertwining enabled persons and environment, or students and their subjects, to embrace each other in an endless erotic exchange? What if, at the very least, our education could cultivate in us the necessary predisposition for this dynamic, loving relationship? I've argued in a couple of pieces elsewhere that an education of this sort would involve a return to the primary definition of the noun study as it's given in the Oxford English Dictionary. So I don't know, perhaps you could bring the next slide up if that's possible. My assistant, yes. My lovely assistant.
Okay, just a second. Here we go.
There we go. And the next slide, please. So, yes, that is indeed the primary definition of the noun study as it's given in the Oxford English Dictionary. Affection, friendliness, devotion to another's welfare, partisan sympathy, desire, inclination, pleasure or interest felt in something. Study is learning which leads to love, and love which leads to learning. However, it's not in itself a method, nor is it a system, a structure, or a design. It is immune to bullet point teaching or handing out pre-digested droppings of data. A quality of attention to the world, to other people, to subjects studied. It is a practice of intense yearning or desire, which is in essence participative and poetic. It's a love relationship. Through study, the eyes and ears are opened both to the beauty of the world and of whatever we happen to be learning or teaching. We are then able to hear the call of beauty, which summons us out of ourselves, back to ourselves, and into a world whose infinite depth is suddenly revealed and, being unfathomable, concealed at the same time. We gaze on our beloved, and our beloved gazes back. And we in our beloved world will forever change as ever more depths are revealed. So our planet becomes once more a sort of Eden, which is a name meaning delight, as I'm sure you know. And we save ourselves and we save the planet by surrendering any notion that somehow we can save or that we are even in control. The Lord knows love, beauty, poetry, delight. The poetics of learning hardly seem fashionable subjects in education and may tend to be rejected as insubstantial, ephemeral, or even preciously effete by some sustainability advocates. As John Zizioulas has written, the ecological crisis we are facing seems to suggest fear, the fear of the destruction of our planet as the prevailing motive for change of direction. End of quotation. Such fear may have the energy to drive the speedy and heroic action some call for to save what we can of the planet. Equally, it may lead to what Zizioulas calls the managerial type of ecology, which essentially views nature as something to be managed, arranged, rearranged, distributed, and consumed. The essential characteristics of both approaches is the idea that fear or dread of the future is to be overcome by an assertion of control. The very concept of ecology may indeed be implicated in the managerial approach, as John Barnett, Emeritus Professor of Higher Education at University College London, argues. Could you move to the next one, please? Thank you. The idea of ecology points to the interconnectedness of all things in the world and even beyond. It gains its power from a sense of impairment, especially a sense that systems, ecosystems, have been corrupted in some way. I just invite you to look at some of the language there. It seems to me that ecology, this understanding of ecology, thus views the natural world as a system. And systems, no matter how complex or inchoate they may be, can be subjected to management. And the abstract nature of this view is revealed by some more of the language that Barnett uses, which conceives of interconnectedness rather than deep personal relationship. Love talk seems to have little place in any of these serious ventures. Love cannot be subject to managerial or any other kind of control, and it shuns the abstract, requiring the particular, the unique, the specific, if it is to exist. Thank you. Behind this turn to study is Gregory of Nyssa's crucial insight. Human nature came into being as something capable of becoming whatever it determines upon and to whatever goal the thrust of its choice leads it. In other words, what we desire and what we desire to know shapes us. If we determine upon a fear-driven approach, whether with fantasies of last-minute heroism or systems controlled by teched-up managers, we may end up in a world in which love is rendered marginal, unimportant, perhaps even irrelevant to the struggle ahead, a waning thing in a world of abstracts and super complex systems. That would be disastrous. As in the words of Callistus Ware, a person that I'm sure you're very familiar with, in the words of Callistus Ware, love is the only true answer to our ecological crisis. We cannot save what we do not love. By contrast, it is the argument of this paper that unless we study in education, unless a mutual erotic yearning for beauty is cultivated in education, human beings as human beings and the world as the world have no future. Our specific concern here then is with relationship to the future of the planet and of course of the individual person as envisaged by study, an infinite stretching out of ever more blissful, loving knowledge as we follow the call of beauty, not that of fear or apprehension or control or indeed safety. We cannot know where it will lead us. Perhaps we need to understand why beauty, like love, has become a rather unfashionable subject in academia. Once, for the ancient Greeks, it was, in the words of Brendan Thomas Salmon, a phenomenon worthy of the most rigorous intellectual inquiry. It inspired virtue and uplifted one towards the divine, and it did that by evoking love. But now it has been marginalized, reduced to product, or something that can be managed with the correct technology. It has become a commodity, something to be bought and sold. It is the most frivolous department in a store, the realm of cosmetics, the ornamental, the decorative. Serious people, and perhaps specifically serious men, roll their eyes and shuffle their feet with discomfort in the beauty section. This marginalization of beauty can be understood as being the result of two main developments. The first is the rise of the aesthetic in the 18th century. The aesthetic effectively reduces the elevating and transformative meaning of beauty to fleshly pleasures and trivial or even unhealthy pursuits. Here, I think the single most influential account in the English language, anyway, was undoubtedly Edmund Burke's A Philosophical Inquiry into the Origin of Our Ideas of the Sublime and Beautiful from the 1750s and 1760s. While Burke associates beauty with love, his treatise also insists that its pleasantly relaxing qualities can lead to languor, lassitude, and enfeeblement. This attractive yet decadent world of beauty, with its attendant relaxing of the solids of the whole system, that's a quote from Burke, relaxing of the solids of the whole system, is explicitly gendered feminine. At the same time as linking beauty to effeminate and dangerously soft flesh, 18th century aesthetics further sideline it by promoting the sublime in its place. Burke describes the sublime as a kind of modified terror, an antidote to love, which is necessary to, and I quote him again, to exercise the finer parts of the system. Without the masculine discipline of the sublime, we would evidently fall into effeminacy and the embarrassment of relaxed solids, leading to dissipation both of body and mind. As beauty subsided, it was replaced by the sublime as the mark of the highest of human experience and knowledge. When Rudolf Otto came to identify the essence of religion in an experience of the numinous with all its awe and terror, he remarked on, I'm quoting him, the hidden kinship between the numinous and the sublime. Later, despite their lofty skepticism and even nihilism, many of the central thinkers of what may be loosely termed postmodernism found the sublime a much more congenial topic than the beautiful. And if you're interested in this topic, you can read about it in David Bentley Hart's The Beauty of the Infinite from 2003. That's postmodernism and sublime and beauty. Beauty and love, it seems, are not worth talking about unless subjected to the scrupulous discipline of sublime terror, in which case they effectively cease to be. We may be said to live in an age in which the sublime continues to rule the future of the planet, fantasized as being a prolongation of terror and pain, is there to rein us in. Education institutions themselves are deemed flagrantly flabby and subjected to the sublime regimen of managerialism. No problem. I will just try to give you a roguish wink next time. So this is a quotation coming up from David R. Lee. There we go. Managerialism claims to restructure bureaucratic organizations for greater efficiency and economy. These claims are linked to the belief that the public sector is inefficient, wasteful, thus not giving value for money because of the absence of an automatic disciplining mechanism. I like that phrase, an automatic disciplining mechanism. Studying and teaching are controlled by the firm hand of outcomes, quality control, and constant evaluation, all of which attempt to control and coerce the academic, the student, and the very subject studied. Education has become an exercise in the managerial sublime, whose rigors reduce the call of beauty, if it is heard at all, to a tight, strangulated squeak. Study, in the sense outlined above, has little place here. So study as desire and partisan sympathy and the giving of the self. Study has, excuse me, lost my place. In the sense outlined above, has little place here, and humans adapt themselves to what is desired, transforming themselves into Lee's automatic disciplining mechanisms. So, in the words of Richard Hall, the university functions as an anxiety machine, which denies that for which humans yearn. As a concomitant, it manufactures hopelessness about the future. Thus, the managerial sublime, as imposed on academics and students, serves to sever us from any sustainability, whether ecological or educational. There is, however, an alternative, if relatively little known, discourse on beauty, which regards it once more as a revelation of infinite potential and transformation, something which could liberate the yearning of the studious. This is to be found in Theology. Notable recent books on the subject include David Bentley Hart's aforementioned The Beauty of the Infinite from 2003.
I will be a burden.
I don't think so. Two books by Brendan Thomas Salmon, The God Who is Beauty, and the other book is called Called to Attraction, An Introduction to the Theology of Beauty. Then there is Beauty, A Theological Engagement with Gregory of Nyssa by Natalie Carnes, and Julius Johnson's The Father of Lights, A Theology of Beauty, all of which owe a greater or lesser debt to von Balthasar's great 7-volume The Glory of the Lord. So my present comments rest to actually a very large extent on the insights of these authors, but in particular on insights offered by the theology of the Eastern Orthodox Church. Study, however, is as much beauty or perhaps poetry-based as it is God-based, or if that's not right, perhaps better, the poetry is in the divine presence, and the divine presence is in the poetry. As St. Porphyrius said, thank you, for a person to become a Christian, he must have a poetic soul. That word missing there perhaps from the screen is the word poetic. He must have a poetic soul. He must become a poet. Christ does not wish insensitive souls in his company. A Christian, albeit only when he loves, is a poet and lives amid poetry. It's one of my favourite quotations. Christ does not wish insensitive souls in his company. I love that. In this context, it's worth remembering the main reason given in Lynn White Jr.'s still influential The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis, which was published in 1967. In this very short but influential work, he explicitly excludes the Eastern Church from accusations that Christianity is radically implicated in environmental catastrophe. And White writes that nature is conceived by orthodoxy primarily as a symbolic system through which God speaks to men. This view of nature is essentially, he writes, artistic rather than scientific. And then I'll move on to the next quotation, the next slide, please. Thank you. There's Chrysavgis, I do apologise if I mangle his name, Chrysavgis, and Falk's comment. White's understanding of Orthodox Christianity here is far from flawless, but his instincts are sound, for he sees that in the Christian East, as was the case in the earliest Christian thought of the patristic era, creation was understood not mechanically, but aesthetically, not as an impersonally functioning mechanism, but as the personal revelation of a loving creator, not as a freestanding substance with which to fabricate commodities to satisfy our desires, but as an endless love poem meant for us to read and reread, to heed and treasure. An endless love poem meant for us to read and reread, to heed and treasure. And elsewhere, the same person, Fultz, argues that it was early Christianity that first cultivated the very love for nature, the feel for nature, the appreciation of the beauty of nature for its own sake, that not only inspired the Romantic movement of the 19th century, but continues to animate the environmentalism today. Basil the Great in the 4th century, for example, wrote, "The world is a work of art displayed for the beholding of all people."
Esse contra-argumento dos cristãos, àquela história de que os cristãos destruíram o amor dos pagãos com a natureza. Mas ao contrário disso, os cristãos foram os primeiros a inventar.
I don't know if that's being broadcast or...
I'm afraid it is.
Okay.
O primeiro é claro.
So I'll just...
With the microphone on.
Yeah. I'll just continue. Yes. Basil the Great in the 4th century wrote that the world is a work of art displayed for the beholding of all people. It was the same Basil who's credited with composing what is likely the first example in antiquity of praise for natural beauty that's not pastoral, but wild and uncultivated. Given even half a chance, the beauty of this work of art, this infinite love poem, may still attract the desire of the studious heart, despite the disciplinary efforts of the sublime in their various manifestations, and thus liberate us from our internalized disciplining mechanisms. It's okay. We can move on anyway. Thank you. The philosopher, poet, literary critic, theologian, and follower of Sophia, Vladimir Soloviev, describes how this liberation through beauty and love may occur. A liberation through study, essentially, is what I'm arguing. Humans studying the beauty of creatures participate in that beauty, are filled with it until they complete it in artistic creation, where it has a perfection not found even in nature. And Soloviev writes, today's art, in its greatest works, captures flashes of eternal beauty in our current reality and extends them further, forewarns, gives presentiment of a supernatural future reality for us, and serves in this way as a transition and connecting link between the beauty of nature and the beauty of the world to come. Art understood in this way ceases being empty amusement and becomes an important and edifying concern in the sense of inspired prophecy. Solofiev's artist is, in effect, a student. She concentrates her pleasures, her desire, her sympathy on the beauty of animals, which enables her to carry further nature's hints and yearnings for the perfection of beauty. The artist, stroke student, captures a timeless yet ever-shifting moment, which is above all a prophecy of beauty yet to come, yet to be unveiled. This is the prophetic vision of an other sort of life, a divinized life seen in and through biological life, which remains always not quite here, but nevertheless perceptible to those who study. Beauty thus has the potential to pull us into a world forever being transfigured by those who study it. It can open up a future which is also the present, remade and freed of the discipline imposed by the sublime in all its various forms. It's a world of endless depth and endless transformation, unbounded by fear or control. It's also inevitably a form of co-creation, as the studious senses participate in the creativity of nature, seeing, as Solofiev says here, in flashes, what is, in any case, always already there, paradise and the presence of God. Study, then, is an encounter with nature, which reveals a boundless future, and which is always approachable and knowable, but never graspable. It's always more, always an excess, pulling us onward. This experience is also an experience which has been long known. In the words of Gregory of Nyssa in The Life of Moses, we can conceive then, says Gregory, we can conceive then of no limitation in an infinite nature, and that which is limitless cannot by its nature be understood. And so every desire for the beautiful which draws us on in this ascent is intensified by the soul's very progress towards it. And this is the real meaning of seeing God, never to have this desire satisfied. No limitation can be put upon the beautiful. And the increase in our desire for the beautiful cannot be stopped by any sense of satisfaction. Our desire, released from the shackles of the sublime, turns to the beautiful. And since what we desire and what we desire to learn shapes us, at the same time we become aware of our own infinite depths, stretching out into a future form, suspected but never reached. Study is always a knowing, which is a kind of unknowing. We never know what the studious gaze will reveal in us and in nature, but we do know it will be even better than what is revealed in any given moment. It's dynamic. It's never-ending. It's free of knowable outcomes. Instead, it releases an instinct that life and liveliness taste of eternity. Unlike what Gregory in his homilies on the Song of Songs calls this dead and animal life, this merely biological life to which many are accustomed. This understanding moves well beyond sustainability, understood as sustaining life or systems or institutions or persons or technologies or cultures or learning or knowledge or even the natural environment. It moves to even beyond Barnett's view that the ecological university should be concerned with advancing or strengthening or positively developing life in all of its forms. Barnett's ideas still smack of an investment in control, In planning the future, the student of beauty, by contrast, abandons control for unpredictable transformation. The managerial sublime, or any attempt to deny students this experience, is an attempt to bar them from these possibilities, to clamp down on life and blot out the future. It has the stench of death about it. It's also worth pointing out that the infinite increase and never-ending transformation to which beauty frees the person studying is not based on any fantasy of economic expansion or procession of products which claim to be enhanced or updated. It does not rely on consuming ever more and ever newer products. It does not require that we learn ever more IT applications just to keep up, or worse, to be able to stay where we are. All those just use up more resources and energy and time. Beauty opens and addresses an ever-expanding and changing and never-predictable future which fills but never fills by orienting our ecstatic desire. If study opens up the human person to beauty, then equally beauty can engender study if it's not obliterated in the first place. So I'm quoting Dionysius the Areopagite now. Beauty, writes Dionysius, beauty bids all things to itself, whence it is called beauty, and gathers everything into itself. And this, as he writes, beauty bids all things to itself. He's actually making a traditional pun on kalos, which is beauty or goodness, and the verb kaleo, to call or bid or summon. So the pun is, the idea is that beauty has within it necessarily something that calls to us and calls something out of us. So beauty calls all to itself if we're not prevented by fear, and its call is Eros. And Eros here means yearning, desire. Gregory of Nyssa's homilies on the Song of Songs are a lengthy meditation on the awakening of Eros by beauty. As the bride is able to gaze ever more closely on the bridegroom, she sees the unspeakable beauty of the bridegroom. So I'm quoting Gregory here. She sees the unspeakable beauty of the bridegroom with a pure eye, and in this way is wounded by the incorporeal and fiery arrow of love, or agape. When, for agape, when intensified, is called Eros. Let's read that again. I mangled it a bit. As the bride is able to gaze ever more closely on the bridegroom, she sees the unspeakable beauty of the bridegroom with a pure eye, and in this way is wounded by the incorporeal and fiery arrow of love. For agape, when intensified, writes Gregory, is called Eros. Eros is an intensification, a moreness of agape. And Dionysius the Areopagite writes, some of our writers on sacred matters have thought the title Eros to be more divine than agape. So thought the title yearning to be more divine than love. This desire, this yearning, this erotic calling provides the energy which draws us endlessly towards divine beauty. And study is nothing but a commensurate response to this erotic calling of an infinitely beautiful creation. It answers with its own powerful desire. A study answers with its own powerful desire or yearning, its devotion or pleasure, its energetic eros. Hearing and following the call of the beautiful, we then pursue our vocation, our personal calling, and as such, study is in stark contrast to the ideologies of employability. Employability disciplines students and teachers into conforming to the given requirements of employers. As those given requirements are known in advance, employability merely manufactures the same rather than an unpredictable and ecstatic future of beautiful and infinite hyperplenitude. It's too employability has a stench of death about it. Our vocation then is ecstasy. As we're drawn on forever into the infinite future of the world, and the world is what it is and becomes what it is and will be endlessly. Not that the world around us disappears, rather we see in and through it ever more those flashes of beauty mentioned by Soloviev. As we study, we develop what Callistus Ware calls double vision. And he goes on, by a strange paradox, the more a thing becomes transparent, the more it is seen as uniquely itself. He goes on to explain, we are to perceive each kingfisher, each frog, each human face, each blade of grass in its uniqueness. Each is to be real for us, each is to be immediate. Only when to the eyes of the student is revealed the utter, irrefragable presence of a particular tree are they able to perceive the infinity of beauty within it and through it. Ware makes clear that when he's talking about double vision, he's referring to William Blake's statement in a letter to Thomas Butts that, and this is what Blake says, a double vision is always with me. Study's yearning gaze is poetic and imaginative and abjures the perceptions of the scientific literalist for being in essence comatose. Blake concludes, may God us keep from single vision and Newton's sleep. May God us keep from single vision and Newton's sleep. All human beings should study to become poets, to hand back the future to the environment and also, of course, to themselves. We and all beings with us deserve our fathomlessly free beauty. The word poet is not meant to imply that we should all begin scribbling verse, however. Why should one do that if it's not one's vocation? Poetry is rather a kind of quality of vision, the kind of quality of vision that one brings to whatever one's calling is. Loving, yearning, desirous of evermore, knowing too that that excess is always about to be. All subjects should be a kind of applied poetics, as should all professions, no matter how much the sublimely masculine may sneer. How may study achieve this? I think through attention to beauty. But that's not enough. And here I must say that hardly any of my students are Christians. Many of them are radically skeptical of Christianity. So for me, it's a question of awakening in students a sense of something else, a sense of otherliness in the world around us, a depth in which we can find our own depth by being in relationship with it. An other, which is beyond all our attempts to conquer, control, or define, but for which we may yearn, and which opens up the possibility of ourselves becoming freed from sameness or fear, to be also utterly transfigured and transformed. Something which restores to the world and ourselves a future, here and now, and always. This is a question, I think, of a style of teaching which both educates and evokes, in the etymological sense of the word evoke, of calling something out of the student, something which cannot be known in advance. Of course, such a view implies that teachers are themselves calling forth something which they do not and cannot control, something which is other from the teachers, a revelation to all concerned. Evocation, in other words, requires that the something else calls through the teacher, but in exactly the way that that particular teacher would put it. In evoking, the teacher's giving voice to their vocation, which by its very nature is always present and always beyond them and ever poetic. In my own teaching, I prefer to focus on somehow letting the infinite beauty, letting in the infinite beauty of the something else. I found a very good way of doing this is by taking students on walks. I live in a rather lovely part of the world, and so I've got to know quite a lot of the folklore, etc. The legends of the area where I live. I take my students on walks and tell stories about the countryside. But if one is unable to do this, if one is unable to leave the classroom, then even talking the walk may do the trick. Sessions, could you pass it on to the next one, please? So we can see the rather wonderful postman. Sessions in several different modules have been dedicated, for example, to Joseph Ferdinand Cheval. Many apologies for my French accent. The so-called facteur Cheval. Facteur Cheval just, of course, means Cheval the postman. There he is. Look at him. He is the embodiment of a postman, I think. He has become a postman. And look at those eyes. What are they looking at? Wouldn't you like to look at whatever he's looking at? Wouldn't you like to have eyes like that? I know I would. I'd like to have a hat like that too. So I teach several sessions in various different modules on the facteur Cheval, an obscure French postman, a prolific walker and builder of the extraordinary, the visionary palais idéal. It's the story of how a sudden and unexpected encounter with an infinitely creative power in and through nature called forth a commensurate creativity, a poetry in an ordinary man, revealing to him in the flesh his vocation. So the facteur became a postman in 1867 when he was 30. His round covered about 20 miles, that's 32 kilometers. He was covering very rough territory, no roads, no bicycle. So he did it on foot in all weathers, carrying a great big heavy satchel full of journals and packets and parcels as well as letters. To beguile the time on this long round, he explored in his thoughts a huge castle of his own invention, extending it year by year. He's doing this in his thoughts as he's walking. In a short autobiographical cahier, a notebook of 1911, he wrote, "Constantly walking in the same surroundings, what could I do but dream? What about? Well, as a diversion for my mind, I built a fairy-like palace beyond imagination, with all that the genius of a humble man could conceive, with grottos, towers, gardens, castles, art galleries and sculptures, trying to bring back to life all the ancient architectures of primeval times." He goes on, "The whole thing was so pretty, so picturesque, that for at least 10 years I could remember it vividly in my mind. And then, after 10 years, this fairy palace of the imagination vanished. And he found himself possessed by a powerful yearning, a powerful desire to wander the castle in his body as well as in his mind. But this very desire blocked his ability to conjure it. He realized that he simply didn't have the skills to construct this imaginary palace this castle in the world outside his mind. Unable to build it, he fell into a kind of an utter depression and lost his ability to imagine. Evicted from the place of his longings, he then trudged his round for a couple of years until a sudden jarring shock to his body opened him up to what seems to be an infinite creative power within nature itself. So in April 1879, around Easter, he stumbled and almost fell over something. Imagine walking, great, big, heavy satchel, walk, and then, oh, blimey. And he stumbles, almost falls, but he does, as happens when you almost fall over, you trip, you look around, what the? And he sees an incredible stone. And he describes it like this. He saw a rock resembling a sculpture as bizarre as it is impossible for man to imitate. It represents every species of animal, every kind of caricature. I said to myself, since nature wants to sculpt, then I will turn my hand to masonry and architecture. So he sees this extraordinary creativity, wanting to come through in a flash, just like Soloviev says, in a flash. He sees something wanting to come through in nature. Nature wants to sculpt, he says, and it inspires him. He starts to participate with nature, with this rock, to try to bring forth and body forth the beauty that he experienced in that flash of imagination and inspiration as he stared at the rock that he had stumbled over, the stumbling block. As experienced by the facteur, an infinite creative willpower possessed by nature itself breaks into him, and what happens is it releases his own power to make. He is unstoppably and unpredictably transforms as he builds the astounding masterpiece of visionary architecture called the Palais Idéal. And the next slide will show just a very, very small part. No photos that I have ever seen capture the sheer magnificence of the Palais Idéal in Haute-Live in France. I had to just sit down and almost cry when I first saw it. You may not believe that looking at that photo. It's an extraordinary building. And on one of its facades, that's a very kind of short facade. On a longer facade, Cheval writes his name in large letters, C-H-E-V-A-L, right across the facade. So the palace is his transfigured self, immortal as stone, fascinating, and above all, I think, endlessly beautiful. The point of the sessions taught in modules on spirituality, imagination, landscape, even ethics. I've got away with teaching the facteur in ethics. The point is to evoke the transformative effect of an inner desire or yearning, meeting and recognizing an infinitely creative and powerful and beautiful power in and through nature. If you could move on to the next one, please. As the facteur builds, that's a photograph that the facteur had himself made. I don't know if you can see, but near the facing us with the stick is the facteur himself, wearing his postman's uniform, although by that time he'd been retired for, I don't know, 20 years or so. He is a postman. He is the facteur. As the facteur builds, he finally comes to life. He commences, he began his work with a feature which he called the fountain of life. And the fountain of life you can just see over his left shoulder. That's where he started, and he called it the fountain of life. In acknowledgement of the poetic power irrepressibly flowing through him, and that acknowledgement that this power is life itself. He's employed as a postman, but his vocation is to create. As he writes on the palace itself, "La vie sans but est une chimère." Life without a purpose is an illusion. I've got about another page to go, if that's okay. That's it. So we can continue looking at that rather lovely postcard. It's a postcard from the factor to us. It will appear at some moment. La vie sans but est une chimère. Life without a purpose is an illusion. This is the story of an artistic, a poetic relation to the natural world. The point of narrating this story is to evoke and encourage a relationship between human persons and nature, which is more than sustainable. It's a mutual intertwining of creative yearning, which reveals infinite possibilities in both sides. Of course, whether any definite transformation is called forth, I cannot say, but I hope a subtle inner rearrangement occurs. I've also taken students on brief but strange guided walks on campus, which aim at changing the vision of the participants. My fellow walkers proceed in pairs, one with their eyes shut and the other guiding them. The walk is inevitably and deliberately slow, meditative, labyrinthine, and punctuated by my reading aloud short texts of my own composition. One such mazy stroll, for example, is based around the classic film, one of my favourite films, A Canterbury Tale from 1944. I'll read for you now this first text. It's a description of a walk undertaken by one of the film's characters. This is the little text I read to people as they pause on their walks. Towards the end of the film, A Canterbury Tale, written, directed and produced by Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger in 1944, Alison Smith, played by Sheila Sim, wanders the bombed-out streets of Canterbury, which have been reduced to rubble, flattened by the Blitz of June 1942. She's looking for a particular garage, but in a cityscape devoid of the usual points of reference, she loses orientation completely. She asks a passerby the way and is told, "It is an awful mess. I don't blame you for not knowing where you are, but you get a good view of the cathedral from here." Alison turns around and sees, as if for the first time, the cathedral. It is as if it had simply not been there before and is now revealed by the absence of buildings around it. With the aid of this sight, she's now able to orient herself and eventually find the garage, where she will be told that her lover, whom she believed killed in action, has in fact survived and is returning to her. She's overcome by joy. It's the end of the short text that I read. Alison and the city of Canterbury are both suddenly and unpredictably transformed by the unexpected appearance of the cathedral, which thus plays a similar role to the factor's stumbling block. The beauty of the cathedral, hitherto invisible to her, appearing in and through a world literally flattened and disfigured by the actions of man, leads Alison out of despair into fulfillment, drawing her ever forward for what will be the rest of her life with her lover. She is the bride of the Song of Songs, to whose astonished eyes the bridegroom is revealed, and an eternity of ever greater Eros is opened. Short quotation from Gregory of Nyssa's homilies on the Song of Songs. As then the veil of hopelessness is lifted, and she, that is the bride, and she sees the infinite and unlimited beauty of her beloved, a beauty that for all eternity of the ages is ever and again discovered to be greater. She is pulled by a yet more intense yearning. A beauty that for all eternity of the ages is ever and again discovered to be greater. And she's pulled by a yet more intense yearning. It's hoped that the walk that I talked about may change the relationship of participants to the campus and thereby the university, which may thereby, at least for a moment, be freed of the dead hand of the managerial sublime and become a place of study that is life, beauty, plenitude, God. Of course, I can never know what the effect on students of the walks and talks will be. If anything, nothing is guaranteed, but there is still the mad wager that students, like the facteur Cheval, will fall headlong in love with their studies and with the world, to plunge without fear and without restraint ever further into a mutual embrace, which will never end and which is always uncontrollably in excess of what it is. Delight. Thank you. So with the words delight, my talk ends. Thank you. If anybody has any comments, any questions, I'll be very glad to try to answer them, although I do reserve the right to merely nod sagely and move on to the next question. And maybe I'll just add, as is possibly very obvious from my talk, I'm not actually a theologian, so I'm a bit of an imposter.
So if people have questions, either use the little yellow hand to signal your intention to ask the question, or well, if you turn on your camera, then we could see you raising your actual hand.
Actual hands are good.
Actually, the beauty of the actual hand. Yes.
Speak of which.
Charlotte.
Does beauty inevitably make us kind? And so I was thinking about what you were saying about masculinity and thinking about its relationship to masculinity and fascism.
Can't hear.
We have to move a little bit. We're going to move the microphone. Just a moment. Do you want to do that, Krista?
Put it in the center. Okay. Try again.
Technology. Hello. The question is whether beauty inevitably makes us kind. And the thought was in relation to what Simon was saying about sublimity and thinking about that in relation to fascism and a certain sort of masculinity in relation to fascism and unkindness. So whether beauty inevitably is the antithesis of that?
In the sense that I've been trying to talk about it, and not really describe it, but in fact evoke it, I would say, at the very least, it nurtures a kindness. It nurtures a deep relationship, I think, with a person. That person, when I say person, that's understood in the widest sense. Could be a human being, could be a blade of grass, could indeed be perhaps even a rock, if we look at a rock in the way that the facteur Cheval did. And we enter into, I think, a kind of a deep love relationship. When I say love, then I don't necessarily mean romantic love. I just mean a certain quality of mutual relationship with the other person. And I think kind and kindness are the very least, actually, of what may emerge from that. I think also, you know, in talking about beauty and relationship and love relationship, it's all. I'm also not talking about relationships which necessarily go on for years. It could be the kind of relationship that the Good Samaritan had with the beaten up old Jew at the side of the road, or the Samaritan was able to establish step out of himself and establish a love relationship with the injured person. But this didn't go on forever. He places him in an inn and he makes sure that the person is being looked after. So it's, in a way, it is a knowing. In a way, it's a kind of knowing what to do at any given moment. And I don't think that's ever unkind.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Christoph.
Can you hear me? Yeah. I have a similar question, maybe a follow-up question to some extent. First of all, thank you very much for your beautiful talk.
Thank you.
You didn't say much about the relationship between beauty and evil and sin. Now one could, of course, argue that to disregard beauty and love, you know, that's evil and sin. And that's basically what you were saying to some extent.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, Dostoevsky famously said, beauty will save the world. But, you know, he said a lot more about beauty. So beauty can also lead to the demonic. So it's maybe not beauty itself that is the problem, but the way beauty is perceived under the conditions of the fall. So even the real beauty. So in other words, beauty itself may be highly ambiguous, you know, even real beauty, not pseudo beauty, even if not perceived in the right way. And Dostoevsky would be a good example, also his novels to some extent, you know. Rogojin Kills, not Stasy Filipovna. It's just an example from erotic love that somehow goes wrong. There are many other examples. Maybe could you briefly comment on this?
And poor old Prince Mishkin is unable to prevent this.
Yes.
What can I say? Perhaps Maximus the Confessor would say that it's a question of how this yearning and desire is directed and to what it's directed to. So you talked about sin. I think St. Maximus talks about sin entering in through the serpent in the form of self-love, a philautia. It's love, but it's love directed inwards rather than a moving outwards and an abandoning or surrendering of the self to and for another person. So the love is twisted, and it's as if it kind of rebounds, and we form a hard carapace around ourselves, which, you know, I suppose they're talking more kind of 21st century language, then just builds up ego rather than the movements out of oneself in the presence of an other. And I guess once that has happened, then the desire and the yearning continue to, I mean, I think everybody is drawn on at any given moment by a desire for more. It's how advertising works. It's I know the advertising for the Lufthansa kind of, you know, miles card, whatever it's called. I don't know what it is now, but it used to be miles and more. It's saying, you take this and you will get more and more and more. It's a false infinity, a false target, a telos of the desire. Because although it seems to be offering us that the true infinity of beauty, all it does is turn our desire to things which we can use and things which you can essentially consume for our own fulfillment, so our own self-love, rather than a love for an other, however one conceives of that other. So, in the fallen world, you're right, the love, or the direction of love and beauty, they can and have become, for many of us, misdirected, turned into something else, perverted, corrupted, if you like. I don't know about that language, but there you go. But they're still there, and that's really the point of what I was trying to talk about, or trying to evoke with study. It is a reopening of the person to the possibility of a different kind, a something other, a different kind of beauty, a beauty which is divine and not just something that I can use for my own gratification, so that I feel, better for the moment and superior to other people for a moment. So I don't know if that answers the question.
There is another question from Jeremy, who was raised his hand some while ago.
Jeremy, it's mute.
We can't hear you for some reason, Jeremy.
Better?
Oh, yes.
Excellent. So this is to continue the conversation. I don't know if you remember the last time, but it's fascinating.
I do, yes, I do.
Fascinating presentation. And the first thing is in terms of relevant texts. In the Russian tradition, Berdayev started out with a book called The Meaning of the Creative Act. Mm-hmm. And in that he talks about very many of the themes you have, the going out of oneself, the ecstasy. Mm-hmm. God is creative, and the need for the person to be co-creating with mm-hmm. God, and then also this whole model of turning away from the possibility of being creative into an opaque, controlled, deterministic world. You used commoditization. He doesn't use that, and so it's a very interesting parallel analysis that he wrote in a single gust of creativity. It is available now in English. The other
excuse me, can I interrupt you then? Yes. What's the name of the text, please? Because
in English it's called The Meaning of the Creative Act.
The Meaning of the Creative Act, thank you. Because I don't know it.
Yeah, in the French it's Le Sens de la Création. The English is more close to the Russian. The second is to say that I think it's Jan Horace or either Clément says that beauty is another name for God, which seems very relevant to what you're saying.
I think Dionysius the Areopagite also says that, doesn't he?
That's very good.
It's one of the many names of God.
That's a very high name. But the last is a very interesting meditation of Olivier Clément on the Shinto tradition and on Japan, on his encounter with the Japanese temple, the haiku, the Japanese garden, and what he calls the arness, the aite of things. And that link to the way in the Japanese tradition, there's this real grasp of the moment, of the essence of the thing, I think would be a very interesting link to explore here.
Yes, I think
my thoughts.
Yeah, I think you're right. Thank you for the Berdiev. I don't really know his work at all. In fact, I'll just say I don't know his work at all.
He's almost impossible to read because he's verbose and discontinuous, and it's good to find someone who synthesized him for you. He's very, very challenging.
But it sounds interesting, interesting and verbose. Yeah, the in the momentness that you pick up on in and mention in relation to Clement and Shinto. Yes, I'm moving towards that really towards the end of my paper. That it in a way being in love is or love, a love relationship is that moment. It's being in the fullest meaning of the word being, and it's a kind of knowing. It's a knowing the other person, or knowing that tree or whatever it is, and knowing what to do if one has to do anything. So there's a kind of if I may use that word, a kind of a mastery, a masterful knowing of what the appropriate action to take is, that emerges out of that moment, and only that moment, in the same sense that it emerges out of that person and only that person. And it couldn't be another person. That's the kind of the uniqueness of love and the love relationship, and the unpredictability and uncontrollability of love. It's always that particular tree and that particular person, and another person may not understand at all why that love relationship emerges. But it's a question of the moments too, being in the moment with that particular person, and with God shining in and through that particular animal, that particular kingfisher, that particular. So it's a kind of a fullness of the moment. I think a speaking fullness of the moment, if that makes sense. But thank you. Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
There's also a question from Elizabeth.
Yes, thank you very much. I won't put the camera on because of problems with connection. Simon, thank you very much. I'd hope to be there in person to meet you. The reason that I'm not is that I'm at a seminar in a symposium in Trondheim on the subject of seeing nature, and its contemplative ecology as the subtitle, centered on the Pilgrim Center of St. Olaf in Trondheim, which is absolutely fascinating. I hope that the talks will be available. Many connections with what you're talking about. One of the things that occurred to me when you were talking was that the sort of negative and belittling approach to beauty, I think, is becomes much more of a problem as beauty gets further away from the sense of the Greek kalos, which is goodness and beauty, and the two really indistinguishable. One of the things, but because the theme of this symposium that I'm at is seeing nature, one of the things that comes up in several of the talks is purifying the senses, training the senses. In other words, perceiving the true goodness and beauty of the thing, rather than a sort of meretricious surface beauty, more akin to the beauty products. I mean, I'd like to give a sense of, some of the talks we've had here. One, Love's Deepest Abyss, Contemplative Practice and Common Life, by Douglas Christie. Another on Coleridge's contemplative reading of the Book of Nature. David Jones and the Art of Perceiving the World. Talk by the local Roman Catholic bishop on seeing chastely. One coming up, Wise Passiveness, Responding to the Call of Nature, with Wordsworth and Marion. And I think one thing, you might take heart from the fact that there are quite a lot of people who are looking at natural beauty in this way, both in your sense erotic, but also very sober, and aware of the ascetic preparation needed. Sorry, that's a sort of a rambling intervention and not a question, but I've told many people here about your talk, and we'll put them onto the recording.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Elizabeth. Yeah, it's a shame that you're not here, but I think I may be meeting up with you in July in Canterbury at the workshop.
That's right. Yes.
Yes, I mean, I didn't go into what one could call asceticism in this paper. I think I did touch on it in the previous paper that I gave for IOX. But the need for a kind of an asceticism which is not a puritanical denying of the body and the senses, but rather a means by which true vision, true perception is released, a cleaning of the lens, if you like, so that one can see what is in any case already there, but obscured by false seeing, by desires, passions.
I'm sure you know Florensky's characterization of asceticism as being in love with creation.
I don't know if I did know that, but thank you for putting me onto that. That's the pillar in the ground of the truth.
Yes, it's the chapter on creation.
I'll take another look at that. Thank you. Yes, it's about also about looking at things that are good for us, if you see what I mean, too. Asceticism can also mean making the right kind of choice over what I watch on television or the internet, for example, so that my brain is not flooded by images that it really shouldn't be flooded by, and I really shouldn't have in my mind. I can think of several that I have seen and I wish I'd never seen. A switching off and a looking away and a looking at other things, beautiful things. For example, a training, I suppose, a training of the senses to be called by beauty rather than succumbing to the temptations of the apparent infinite temptations of the internet, for example. Yes, that's very interesting. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I'd quite like to say something. Yeah, I mean, in general terms, I'm quite sympathetic to what you're saying. I wasn't entirely happy about the way you dealt with the sublime, basically. I actually, you mentioned Otto briefly, and the idea of the sublime and the numinous being closely related to the sublime, and that's more or less where I am. And it seems to me that you've sort of somehow smuggled what you want from the sublime into your concept of beauty, and then dissed what's left of the sublime. And I, particularly felt this phrase, the managerial sublime, is one that I actually really pushed back against. So you set up the opposition of the sublime and the beautiful, but then it seemed to me that you use the good bits of the sublime, put them in the beautiful, and then rubbish the rest of the sublime, basically.
I'm very, very fond of Otto. I do like the idea of the Holy. It's a wonderful book, and it's influenced me a lot. So his idea, I don't mean to diss the sublime or indeed the numinous as such. I think my point was that kind of prior to a certain moment in the 18th century, we can always find a date. We can say it's in the 18th century, it's in the 17th century, it's in the 19th. Doesn't really matter. It's symbolic in the end. But prior to a certain moment in the 18th century, it was through beauty that one experienced that the highest forms of the divine. And then it's not that I was taking the best parts of the sublime and then inserting them, oh, that's a horrible image, into the beautiful. That I think I was arguing that the opposite was that the various aspects of beauty and the beautiful had been annexed by the sublime, and I'd like them to be returned gently to beauty. But I think that the numinous is very interesting, and it isn't just the sublime, although Otto says that there's a great overlap, because it involves both the mysterium tremendum, that which creates awe and terror in me, and the mysterium fascinans, that which draws me to it. It has a wonderful tension in it. It has the kind of sublime awe, but it's drawing me to it as I might be drawn to something beautiful too. So maybe his idea of a concept of the numinous is actually able to encompass both the sublime and the beautiful, if that makes sense.
I mean, you use the word infinite quite a lot in relation to the beautiful, which to me the infinite is a sublime term.
That is how it's, I think I would say, how it has become understood. But I think in trying to, as I was trying to bring out through the Gregory of Nyssa quotations, I mean, he writes about the never-endingness and of our being drawn on in a love relationship with God in a kind of an endless epectasis, as he calls it, kind of being drawn or stretched on and on and on, and it never ending. That's where I kind of took the idea of infinite, of a kind of infinite, and an infinite which is in the beautiful. His wonderful homilies on the Song of Songs are a great long meditation on a falling, on a love relationship, and the never-ending transformations and knowledge of the bridegroom and knowledge of the self that this creates, and that's a kind of an infinite transformation, which is brought about by beauty and love.
Yeah, no, I can see what you're saying. Yeah.
I'm not, but still, but I talked about the beautiful and the sublime for I don't know, maybe 5 minutes or something like that. And I'm sure I didn't do the sublime justice.
It's that phrase, the managerial sublime, that most got to me.
I'm so sorry.
Someone who's been a head of department. Thanks, yeah.
I've always thought of the word sublime in relation to you.
Well, I think we've reached very quickly, time flies when you're having fun, the end of our lecture today, unless there are some brief questions from our participants online, or indeed from people present here. We'll try to draw this to a close. Okay, well, there don't seem to be more questions. So we'll thank Simon for his wonderful presentation and for bringing poetry back into our lives. And thank you to you people who have braved the distances and have come to be here physically with us at Wesley House in Cambridge today. And also, not least, the people who have taken time to watch our lecture, Simon's lecture. So thank you all. Thank you, Simon, once again.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
And do come to our next IOCS event.